and the map is not the territory.
Yeah.
Once you understand that the map is not the territory, and start looking at the territory and throw the map out, then you're on your way.
Yeah, and I think there's an obvious distinction in belief systems that we sort of take on that are big, that are obvious, that are like a cult, but like our actual all-day meaning making is doing that same thing, and so that's what I'm going to try and highlight in a really as useful way as I can.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to it. Well, I'll go ahead and get us, introduced, and then we'll see, and then we can come back. So I already had a half an hour conversation with Blaine today, as I told him, which nourished my soul. So Blaine and I met back in 2000, 2010, maybe, in terms of, in particular, I think we mostly crossed paths in the theoretical and philosophical psychology arena. That's Division 24 in the APA. And speaking for myself, at least, he can correct me if I'm wrong, I was immediately drawn to Blaine, and in part because that society, when I got in there, and it's still to this day, it's largely occupied by what I call critical theorists. And Blaine and I think, have what we share is, well, an appreciation for critique of the field of psychology, especially sort of its sort of rampant empiricism that doesn't appreciate some of the dimensions of fact and value complexity. It's also the case that I think we share an idea about what could be constructed, particularly constructed toward the good in various ways. And one of the things that I owe Blaine, particularly in terms of my thinking, is I used to do, I did a lot of teaching in personality theory and personality research. And for issues that will probably become more apparent, and maybe we can dialogue at the end, I shifted the way I talk about personality to going back to talk about character. And indeed, the character wheel and character adaptation systems reflect that term. And I owe that to Blaine. I owe it in relationship to, he's got an excellent book on virtue in psychology. And he'll be talking about some of the themes here today, because it fundamentally, how we frame what we are in a descriptive way feeds back onto what we can be. And I know Steve Quackenbush will be talking about that. And I believe figuring this out, this issue of fact and value, and figuring out ways in which we can frame both the science of psychology and one that orients us towards virtue is really, really unbelievably crucial for the 21st century. It's a gap that we saw emerge in the 20th century. And I think people like Blaine are shining the light on ways to do that. He's the leader of a moral science network, the Network of Moral Research, or Research of Morality, NORM. He's brought together the scholars that bridge morality and science. And he's just a wonderful guy. So I'm really, really happy that he's willing to come down and share his time and expertise with us. So thanks so much, Blaine.
Well, thanks, Greg. That's a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we've been friends for quite a while and have just tons of commonalities. So it's been a real pleasure. I've followed this group to some degree, but I have to say you overwhelm me. So I can't keep up. But it's been interesting to see people's thinking and hear things from outside the field of psychology as well. Some within and some outside. So I always like that. I've always been very interdisciplinary in my thinking. So what I've done is I've done my standard thing of preparing a nice little PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you. But I'll tell you, especially given that it's such a small group, if you have questions or comments as we go through, just let me know. Raise your hand physically or electronically, or say, "Hold on a second there, dude." And, we'll deal with those as we go. The thing about what I'm going to talk about is every line on there could use a whole hour for sure, maybe more. So, but I want to introduce you to the way Aristotle thought about ethics, if you're not already aware of it, and then take it in some directions that I think tie it in with contemporary thinking in a way that's really valuable. So there's a lot of things he knew and figured out 2,300 years ago, and that we figured out since then. So it'd be really interesting to have that conversation with him, of course, but I can only say what I think he would think.
Hmm.
Do that today. Let me just arrange my screens here. Zoom has a way of doing things the way it thinks I want them, and it's always wrong. So I have to tell it what I really want. So now I can see you and the PowerPoint. So this is about Aristotle's ethics of the good. What I'm going to do to start with is I'm just going to read you a few words from the first 2 pages of the Nicomachean Ethics. And I think it's really instructive, and it's Aristotle is actually very accessible in this part. There are parts he gets a little bit more obscure, but he's one of the more accessible philosophers. So if you have any interest in that sort of thing, I recommend any highly. I've found it really valuable. Every time I read it, I get more out of it. So there's just nuances and layers that show up. So he starts in the very first paragraph of the book he's most known for. He starts this way. Every art or applied science and every systematic investigation, and similarly, every action and choice, in other words, everything people do. And I like to stress this point because, especially to scientists, because we think that science is somehow different from ordinary human activity. It really isn't. It's just a different kind of activity, highly specialized one, but it's just as much a human project as anything else. So all these things seem to aim at some good. The good, therefore, has been well defined as that which all things aim. And this is the core of Aristotle's ethic. And that's why I named the talk this way, is that his is an ethics of good. We're used to an ethics of right, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what he thinks is that the core concept of ethics is what is good, and then everything follows from that. And then he says, since there are many activities, arts, and sciences, the number of ends is correspondingly large, which means that he's an ethical pluralist, not an ethical monist. So an ethical monist is somebody who thinks pleasure is the only good, where Aristotle thinks there's a lot of different kind of goods, and it matters that we're inclusive in that way. So he says of medicine, the end is health, of shipbuilding, a vessel. In many instances, several such pursuits are grouped together under a single capacity. In all these cases, the end of the master sciences are preferable to the ends of the subordinate sciences, since the latter are pursued for the sake of the former. So now he says, we're always aiming at some good. There are lots of kind of goods, and those goods can be organized in a kind of hierarchy, that some are more important than others. Some are superordinate, some are subordinate. So he gives the example of with shipbuilding, you have people who build the prow, and people who make the oars, and people who make the sails. And these are all different jobs, but they all come together under the heading of shipbuilding. So that hierarchy is also important to him. And it's not that one thing's good and the other thing's bad. Sometimes people think when you differentiate, one has to be good, one has to be bad. They're all good. It's just it's important to think about the larger good, not just the individual goods. So then he goes from there to say, if exists an end, and he means a single end, which we desire for its own sake, an end which determines all other desires. So if there's one at the very top of the hierarchy, then obviously this end will be the good, that is the highest good. And so that's how he sets up the Nicomachean Ethics. This good belongs to the most sovereign and most comprehensive master science, and politics, not psychology, fits this description. So I love giving this to psychological audiences. One of the temptations with ethics and with Aristotle's understanding of virtue is to psychologize it. And I think we need to resist that tendency. And I have to, especially as a psychologist, to not think of it only in psychological terms. Because his idea of the good is an objective idea of the good. Or he has what's called an objective list theory of the good, which means that it's not just my subjectivity that determines what's good. A lot of the time we think that all of the ends and valuable things in the world are subjective preferences, that it's up to each individual to decide what's worthwhile. Well, that's partly true, but Aristotle thought that there were some general goods that all of us ascribe to and all of us are drawn to, if we understand them correctly. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this language of the good, let me just say that it's the idea of the good or what is good is simply a way of thinking about higher order abstract things like knowledge or justice, or belonging, things that you can't really achieve as an individual, but you can aim toward and bring into your life as part of your life. And then what we usually think about is goals, which are more concrete things that we can accomplish. So if I want to operate in the domain of knowledge, then maybe what I want to do is I want to learn about whole trait theory and personality. So I decide to read some articles, and some books, and maybe a conference, and that way I can learn about whole trait theory. So I participate in the good of knowledge through the goal of learning about that theory. So it's just a matter of more concrete and more abstract. Gregg.
Can you say a little bit, so the idea of politics as the master science is an interesting frame. I'd like to, do you have a way to describe what he's thinking about here in terms of politics?
Yep, next slide. The end of
well, there you
politics
go.
is the good for man. So see, I'll pay you later, Gregg.
All right, man.
So in other words, the goal of politics is creating a good life for people. Of course, we see that that's clearly the goal of our current politics. But Aristotle was talking in an ideal form. He wasn't talking about in a real form. And also, if you know anything about ancient Greece, it wasn't really that peaceful and loving a place. There was a lot of warfare, there was a lot of competition. So it wasn't that different from our society in some ways. So the aim of politics, the highest good attainable, men call it eudaimonia, living well and doing well. And eudaimonia is usually translated in the Nicomachean Ethics as happiness. I don't really like that translation because I think for most of us, it connotes a kind of transient emotional state that I feel happy today, but maybe I won't be happy tonight. Whereas what he means is a complete life lived well. That's what eudaimonia means. So I usually translate it as flourishing. So are we living a flourishing life would be the question of eudaimonia. Then here's where he gets to the answer of Gregg's question, or part of an answer. The good of the polis clearly is the greater and more perfect thing to attain and to safeguard. Polis is just a city, a community, and the attainment of the good for one man alone is a source of satisfaction. Yet to attain it for a nation and for the polis is nobler and more divine. So he's basically saying that what we really want to aim at is the general good, the commonwealth good, not the individual good. The individual good is a subspecies of the common good. And he's really big on this, and a lot of people miss this. I once had about a 20-minute argument with an Aristotelian who insisted that he wasn't interested in the social world. He was only interested in individual development of character. I said, but have you read this? I said, yes. She says, yes, I've read it all. I've read it more times than you have. It was a terrible argument because she just couldn't listen to the idea that this is in fact part of the Nicomachean Ethics. And it is the point of the politics. So one way to look at Aristotle's work is that the Nicomachean Ethics is, again, his most famous work, is the prelude or introduction to the politics, where he talks about how he thinks this can be done, and that he thinks it's the highest good and what we all should aim at. He has some contradictory stuff about philosophy being really the best thing in the world is to be a philosopher, but I think for the practical world, politics is the thing. So we want to try to create a world in which people can flourish, people can thrive, we can have good relationships and strong communities and take care of each other. All that kind of stuff is what he's talking about.
Do you know if this influences like political science as a field? Is there folks that draw on this for framing political science? Do you know?
There must be. I don't know them, but I would like to. I should know them. So I know some sociologists who think this way, and I know some lots of philosophers who think this way, and some educators and some anthropologists, but I don't know any political scientists who think this way.
Yeah, let me reframe Gregg's question. If this was known 2,500 years ago, progress has been really bad, right? I mean, did anybody know this?
Yeah, well, it has been. A recent book by a friend of mine named Tal Brewer, he's a philosopher. What he says is that what we need to do is to retrieve ethics, that it got lost along the way. We went wrong. So what I mentioned before about what's the core of ethics? For Aristotle, it's the good, but for the last several hundred years, it's been the right. the correct thing to do. So ethics is usually framed in terms of rules and duties and obligations and permissions and prohibitions, as though there's a rule book that tells us what ethical means. Now, Immanuel Kant had an interesting take on that. He framed it in terms of a transcendental argument, meaning that what ethics is really respecting our capacities as rational animals, and that's why we treat everyone as an end and never as a means, and that's why we use our rational thinking to come up with what we should do, which is what we wish everyone would do in this situation. So these are some pretty profound thoughts, but in the end of the day, Kant's is a duty-based ethic, and he strongly said that it's not. He talked about virtues, but he says it's not really virtuous unless you have to struggle to get there. So if it's easy, it's not virtuous. Aristotle says exactly the opposite. Our goal is to make virtuous activity easy, and that's what we want. So that's that's really the whole point of the talk, is to get to that business of talking about what makes it easy. So there's Aristotle's ethics, and it's the centrality of the good. So we're looking at things like, I tend to talk about this in terms of human goods, and those human goods are things like knowledge, justice, belonging, beauty, and so on. I could come up with a very long list of goods, but these are things that we tend to strive for. And they're just interesting ways that they show up. We're a curious species. We're a species that depends on each other, that can't really thrive on our own individually, that we need each other deeply. We're a species that cares about justice and fairness. It's built into us, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the centrality of the good then is, these are goods that we basically inherit as the kind of creatures we are. And then within each culture and society and time, we work out what that means. And we're constantly working it out. Aristotle didn't think he had the last word on what's good. And I don't think anyone ever will. These are things that, as long as human beings are around, we're going to continue to discuss and debate. There's going to be change. There's going to be different perspectives from different cultures or different experiences. There are going to be new challenges. We have to figure this stuff out over and over and over again. It's never a done process. But there's some basic ideas about what's good that I think we can put our finger on. I'll give you some ideas about why I believe that, why I don't think it's just up for grabs and can be anything anyone thinks it is. So the second thing about his ethics, it's an ethic of attraction rather than compulsion. So when you read the Nicomachean Ethics, if you read it with the idea of, let me find the rules that are in there, you'll be disappointed because you won't find any. Aristotle does not recommend rules. He says that rules are merely or guidelines, rules of thumb, ways to summarize, to encapsulate things. What's really important is paying attention to the context and engaging practical wisdom, which is his view of making good judgments, wise judgments, to figure out what's the best thing in the situation. So the idea is, whatever situation I'm in, what can I do to bring goodness in the world in this case? So I'm going to say something really heretical, like, what if I'm in a faculty meeting? Can I think about how can I bring good into the world in a faculty meeting?
Has that happened?
Yes. It's part of what saves my sanity in these meetings, because they drive me nuts just like they do everyone else. But what I've learned is to go to the meetings with goals, with things that I want to try to accomplish that I think are going to make our department or our program or our university better. And when I do that, I can usually find at least some segment of the meeting worthwhile. And so the goal could be something as simple as, we have a relatively new junior colleague who doesn't usually speak up, but I know they have some things to say about this topic. My goal is to get their voice heard today. Or my goal is to get a vote on this programmatic change, or my goal is to have us discuss a new way of thinking about something that we do, something like that. So they tend to be pretty concrete things, but it's a way of trying to bring a little bit of goodness into those meetings, because they can be awful. I mean, we all know that. Those of us who've been on a faculty or been in a faculty meeting know that it could just be painful as all get out, and difficult, and sometimes even excruciating. So if we're attracted to the good, though, we're thinking about those kind of things. How can I further cultivate belonging in this group? How can I either create or share knowledge in this presentation? How can I, in my interpersonal relationships, how can I bring fairness into the world? How can I treat people with the respect they deserve and treat them fairly, and so on? So that's his idea, is that those goods are attractive. Now, what happens? I need to see where I am here. Oh yeah, is that we get confused about the goods because we also think other things are good. Other things are also good. So he sees wealth as a good. He sees pleasure as a good. He sees social status as a good, but he sees them as subordinate goods, as essentially instrumental goods. They're things that we go after and we try to attain, but they're really, what makes them good is they help us to live flourishing lives. They're not good in themselves. So having money is not good in itself. And I probably don't have any dissenters in this group about that. I mean, none of us actually went after, I don't think, none of us went after money as a main goal. I don't think you end up in this kind of place if you do that. But money's still good. You need a certain amount of it to make your way in the world and to eat and have a place to live, at least according to Aristotle's views. But it's a subordinate good because it's on the way to these other things. Well, what happens is some people get confused about these deeper goods, what I would call constitutive goods, and instrumental goods, things like money, social status, and power. Those are things that are useful, but they're not good in themselves. But if you get confused and think that's the end in itself, then you become greedy, or you become a miser, or you become a power hungry person. And so you look for opportunities to dominate and to subordinate others. So people get confused about these things. And so because we have multiple goods, it's possible to do that. And these things you can get as products, and you can own them and say, I have this thing, I have this money, or I have this position of power, or I have this other thing that is a valuable thing. And so isn't that great? I've accomplished something. Whereas the other things, these kind of goods like knowledge and belonging, are ongoing processes. They don't get finished. Okay, so now you might ask me, how is it that I can claim that there are human goods that are identifiable? And the way to do that is through Aristotle's function argument. I'm pretty enamored of this argument. So I have here a picture of an eyeball. And if, let's say, we came from a different planet where people don't see, where the beings there don't see, they sense the world in another way. And we describe this eyeball to them and all its parts and how it fits together, they still wouldn't understand what an eye is because they don't have a concept of seeing. So Aristotle's idea is that what defines something isn't just its parts, but its function. So that defines what it is and what it's for. And once you say, oh, well, an eye is for seeing, it's no step at all to say, well, some eyes function better than others, right? I mean, a lot of us have these on. My eyes don't function particularly well. I know this really well personally. I just don't see well. I have a brother who can see things that no one else sees. So on the MMPI, he looks crazy, but he really does see those things. So he'll see, we'll be in the mountains and he'll see 300 yards away an elk or a deer that I can't see without binoculars. And it is truly there. So some eyes work better than others. So you have the function. So now I've got better and worse eyes. So all of a sudden I'm right into the middle of moral questions. And if you can do the same thing with human beings. If we know what our functions are as human beings, we can decide how well we're fulfilling those functions. And Aristotle thought the two primary functions, the overarching functions, were that we're reasoning beings and that we're social beings. Reasoning meaning that we have reasons for what we do, and we hopefully act mostly for good reasons, but we can explain those reasons. We can think about them. We can reflect on them, and that's a good thing. And the second one, sociality, is that he said we're political animals, and he meant both parts, political and animal. So that's where that is. And so the function argument tells us we need to look for human functions. Aristotle gave us these two big abstract categories. Then after that, what I realized is I didn't have a basis for claiming that certain things were goods. And so that took me into the realm of evolution. But first, let me say a word about virtue. Oh, and here's where I also do some shameless self-promoting. This is one of my first books, Virtue and Psychology. The thing about virtue is it's kind of a, well, it's a colloquial term. Everybody uses it. And so a lot of times experts in this area, or people who want to claim to be experts, really just use the colloquial definitions, and they don't really understand what they're talking about very well. And so it ends up being confusing and difficult. But virtue just means excellence. And in Greek, the word is arete. Virtue is not a Greek word. It's derived from the Roman word virtu, which meant something quite different. It was mainly a certain kind of masculinity. But then it gradually got transformed. So virtue now means the same as the Greek arete. And in Greek, that word translates into English pretty much as excellence. So what a virtue is just doing ordinary things excellently. So if we take a virtue like, let's say, generosity. Generosity is pretty common. People do it all the time. They're kind, they're giving, they're solicitous, they're often make room for each other, accommodating. Not always, but often. And so that's kind of normal. It's regular. Little children come with that. They're often very generous. But then you can cultivate that into an acquired trait of generosity that would be a virtue. So that's the idea. So we have some natural capacities that then we can cultivate into being these excellences. Same thing would be true of courage. So we can cultivate the excellence of courage. And that's the idea of virtue, is that we want to create those traits. And then a virtue is also about having an alignment among the various features of our being. So our behavior is aligned with our motivation, which is aligned with our thinking, which is aligned with our perception of what's worthwhile. And so when we do that, we get these things all lined up in one thing, then we can act wholeheartedly. And if we have the proper motivation, what that means for Aristotle is that we understand what's good and we're drawn to it. That's what the proper motivation is. So this attractive force becomes evident and powerful for us. Now I keep seeing the chat go on. Is that people asking questions? Should I be stopping and paying attention to that? It flashes on.
They're just most of them, certainly if there's a question, we'll stop. Most of it's just offering commentary.
Oh, okay.
That maybe we come back to,
okay.
Down the road, but yeah.
Great. I wasn't sure what the practices are here.
Yeah, no, it's just an ongoing chat. And then if there's a question, I'll make sure to, I'll let you know if it seems like it's appropriate.
Great. So this is one of my favorite parts about virtue theory is this idea that the whole key to the thing is learning to love what's good. So learning to love justice, learning to love knowledge, learning to love belonging and the well-being of the group, learning to love beauty. When I say beauty, I don't just mean physical attractiveness. I also mean glorious things like sunsets, or the beauty of symmetry, or the beauty of a musical piece. There's a lot of kinds of beauty. So what we all hope for, those of us who teach, is that our students have a love of learning, that they have a love of knowledge. They come to us wanting to learn things and know things, not just come to us to get a grade, to get a degree, to get a job, to get some money. Some do, and that's part of it for all of us, but we're hoping that there's more to it than that. And it's that love that makes virtue hum. Without it, you don't have virtue. And that's the difference, again, between Aristotle and Kant, is with Aristotle, for him, we're really acting virtuously when we really want to do the thing that is for the good. So we don't have a conflict. So I talk about this with my students as a conflict between duty and desire. Kant believed in that conflict, thought that's what defined morality. Aristotle said, well, of course it's human to have conflict between what you think you want to do or ought to do, but it's better if you don't have that. So if you had a choice between having to fight with your contrary desires, your animal nature or whatever you want to call it, and doing what's good, or being able to do what's good in a spontaneous and wholehearted way, which one would you want? I think the answer to that's really easy. I would want to not have conflict. And about 30 seconds every fourth day, I'm in that state. So
All right, you're rocking it then.
yeah. Yeah, it's probably not quite that bad, but I also like to circle around here and talk about Aristotle's perfectionism. Because if you read him, he reads like a perfectionist. I think he understood that we can't be perfect. And what I always tell my students is, look, I really like continent people. Sometimes I am one. Sometimes continence, which is you have a conflict between what you ought to do or what you think is worth doing and what you want to do. I'd really like to just sleep in. On the other hand, I promised some people I would work on this manuscript. So I'm going to get up, and maybe in the beginning I have to push myself, but then once I get started writing, usually I'm happy to be doing it and it becomes wholehearted. So sometimes it's a bit of an achievement. So he had different character types, and one is virtuous, one is continent. There's also incontinent, which means you have a conflict between your duty and desire, but you don't do the right thing very often. So we all know people like that. And then we have vicious people who are completely confused about what's good and worthwhile. They think wealth and power are the main goals and they pursue them wholeheartedly. That's vicious. So not that we've ever seen anybody like that in our political world or anywhere near 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but so that's the idea, is we want to become whole, that is integrated and aligned, and we want to have that alignment with what's good, which is something that supersedes us entirely. No human being can own the good or somehow be a master of the good. We can participate in what's good, but we can't own it or control it. So that's the way in which it's not just subjective. Then the other piece of it that I should throw in here, and I think that goes with my next bullet point, is the sociality piece, which is that the good is neither subjective in that it's my choice alone, nor is it objective in that it exists in the universe with or without human beings, but it's actually intersubjective. It's something we do together. And that's where it brings in this idea of culture and tradition and mores and ethos and that sort of thing, where we're deciding together what we think is worthwhile, and working with each other on that, taking different opinions into account and so forth. So let me, go ahead, Steve.
Just a quick question relating to that. I've always been interested in the question regarding the relationship between insight and moral development. So I'm wondering, for Aristotle, is insight enough? Is it enough to learn Aristotle's philosophy to become whole and participate in the good? Or is there a social dimension to the process of becoming good, such that if I'm deprived of something in culture, insight would never get me to where I need to be?
Yeah, that's completely correct. Socrates is the one that said to know the good is to follow the good. And we could charitably interpret him to say, knowing it means really being drawn to it and understanding it in the right way. But the way his words read on the paper, at least the way Plato gave them to us, it sounds like just knowing is enough. And Aristotle didn't think that. He thought, number one, what we know is a fairly weak motivator. What we need is our emotional attachment to those things, that love of the good. That's what really moves us. And then, as you intimated, the social dimension is huge for Aristotle, that we need to be taught how to act morally, how to understand and enact virtue, that's not something we come with naturally. He said we come with a natural capacity to do these things, but we need to be taught how to bring them into completion. So he doesn't say nature or nurture or nature versus nurture. He says you have a nature, then you need some nurture. So it's a both and kind of situation. And the other thing about this is that in my investigation into evolution, that's what brought me to this book, The Evolution of Ethics, is the profound way that we're social creatures. And so I was learning this about the time I met Gregg, and for 20 years, I argued for the sociality of human beings from a theoretical direction. Then I started to look at our evolutionary development and realized that there is tons of empirical evidence for this too, and virtually none that were actually independent or autonomous or separate. That evidence just doesn't exist. It's a cultural preoccupation of the West, particularly of the United States, that really misleads us and distorts our lives. So understanding the depth of our sociality is something that's become a real project of mine. And so when it comes to the cultivation of virtue, it's absolutely indispensable. When it comes to the cultivation of anything human, it's indispensable because we're made to be attached to other people. We're made to belong. We have a physiology of belonging that's really easy to identify and show how it works. So we know enough about neuropsychology now to identify the specific mechanisms for that. It's very powerful. So it's one of the few areas where you can go all the way from Aristotle to neuropsychology.
Can you help us understand the concept of sociality in the concept of sociality in the context of our current political leaders?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you've asked yourself, why do these people follow this clown? Doesn't make any sense, right? But it makes sense in terms of their sociality in a very big way, in a lot of ways, actually.
I guess I was asking about his sociality.
Oh, well, he's the lost cause. But what that brings up is I talk about these things like natural human characteristics and natural human goods and so on, but it's not hard to find counterexamples to that, and we always can. So there are always people who don't fit the mold and who are either maybe due to no one's fault, maybe it's just a genetic sort of thing, maybe it's poor socialization, maybe it's being abused or neglected, or growing up in a very violent and criminalized society. There's a lot of different ways that someone's entire psyche could get distorted. Well, here's one, growing up in a Romanian orphanage. If you know about those orphanages, there were thousands of children there, and there were 50 children to each staff member, and they could not be properly cared for. All of those people who survived those orphanages, and some just simply died, not because they didn't get fed and didn't get changed. They just died because they didn't have enough human contact. So that's one example of sociality, is failure to thrive. Babies who don't get contact can die of that lack of contact. Well, anyway, when Ceausescu was killed and the regime overthrown, people streamed into these orphanages and wanted to save these children. A lot of them were adopted, and they were followed medically and psychologically for years. Well, they never overcame the deficits they acquired in the orphanages. So if you're harmed in certain ways, or if you miss developmental windows for certain things, there's no fixing that. You can have some, you can have some therapy and you can have some amelioration, but you can't make it better. Just like, if you're horribly victimized, you can't make it go away. So I think, and this is a nice thing from Aristotle and the other Greeks too, is they understood really well the concept of fortune, good or bad fortune. And if you're in one of those circumstances, you just have horrible luck, because it's typically not the victim's fault whatsoever that they're in that situation. Whether that's a situation of famine, of poverty, of criminality, of abuse, you're just stuck there and you suffer the consequences. Or on the other hand, maybe you're born into a warm and loving family that teaches you good ethics and morals. Well, that's just good luck, because none of us earned that or deserve that. I mean, unless you believe in reincarnation, then maybe you think you've earned it somehow in the past life. But so anyway, that's a brief bit about that. Let me just say the other thing about the evolution of ethics is that I think we evolve to be ethical in our mindsets, that we always pay attention to this, we care about it, we develop ethical systems in every single culture on the planet. They differ a lot, but there's always an ethical system. And so it's something that comes naturally to us. But again, it doesn't mean we're always going to be ethical. It just means we're going to be concerned about ethics. And maybe we're concerned to circumvent them and get more goodies for me, but that's that. And then finally, this idea of frailty is that we are mutually dependent, and that no one gets through life well on their own. And that one way to understand Aristotle's virtues is to think about each one of them as a strength that allows us to deal with the inherent fallibility and frailty of humanity. So a simple example of that is we're inherently dependent on each other. And I don't say that with any qualms at all. But so what we have are virtues like friendship and loyalty. And those are things that help us get through that problem, is that we learn to be closely attached to people who care for us, and we care for them. And that's how we deal with dependence well. We can also deal with it poorly by being counter-dependent or by resisting any suggestion that we need anyone else, but or being overly needy, just being childishly dependent. That's another bad way to deal with it. I apologize. I just realized I've gone well over the time that's usually allotted for these things. What many of you may know personally, or you've certainly experienced, is that you put your quarter in and the professor goes.
All good.
And I am a good example of that.
Mhm.
So should we do some questions, Greg, or have we just kind of time?
I mean,
and
certainly, I mean, there are definitely questions. Are there any other pieces that you wanted to share? I mean, you know, it's not like we're not rigid about the time.
Yeah, no, I pretty much got to the end. I could say a lot more about any of it,
Okay.
but I think as far as the picture, that's the picture I wanted to share with you.
Okay, great. So yeah, why don't we then stop sharing the screen? We'll bring people back and we'll just converse then about the questions. So I had a question that I would definitely, it has to do with learning virtue, and it has two parts. So one is, did he talk about how we can learn to love to be virtuous on the one hand? And then the other part is more about modern society. I think you mentioned a colleague of yours that said we lost sort of the learning to love virtue, or I put this one of the comments I made in the chat box is, how do we reorient our developmental educational systems to instill this cultivation of love of virtue? So the question is, like, how do you shape someone to love virtue? And then how can we, going forward, reinstill this as part of our socializing process?
Yeah, it's a great question. Aristotle did not say a lot about the cultivation and development of virtue. So it's one of the places that he really disappointed us. But he says a few suggestive things. And I think people are starting to work a little bit on this, but we're still pretty early in the game for the most part, at least from a scientific or strong theoretical point of view. So he said things like, we need to have models to understand what virtue is. So we need people to model ourselves on. We need guidance. So we need to be told what's a good thing to do, what's a bad thing to do. So typical child rearing kind of stuff. That it happens better if it happens early. He was a little pessimistic about people becoming virtuous later in life. I don't share that pessimism. I think we can always grow and develop. At least I hope so. I mean, I'm in my 60s and I'm hoping to be better in my 70s than I am now, or at least tomorrow than I am today. So those are a few things he said. He also said that we're naturally inclined toward these things. So what we need are simply opportunities and guidance to move in the right direction. In terms of the society, you probably know about quite a bit of character education is happening in a number of schools, thousands of schools. So that's one possibility for that if it's done well. And it's not, sometimes it's done very poorly. I asked my students in my undergraduate class about this, and most of the examples that come up sound pretty bad to me. So where people are given rewards for acting, for example, exactly the wrong thing to do.
Do you know if there are successful ones? I mean, are there leaders on the list that are in your list that are initiating any of this that you're aware of?
Yeah. Marvin Berkowitz is a really good example of that. He's been into character education for decades, and he trained educational administrators. So he's a really good example of this. There are some other schools that are doing some of this, and there are some programs that have been developed that are available for people to obtain. Like one is called Character Counts. Not that I want to do an ad for them, but they're pretty good. And there's a number of other ones. There's some research on this that suggests that you get a lot of benefit from this in terms of not just, kids having fewer discipline incidences, fewer detentions, fewer expulsions, fewer violent acts, less bullying, better teacher retention, better school climate. So there is some indication that it actually really works.
Okay.
It's a little spotty and it's not great quality research. I just met a young philosopher who's now has her PhD, I believe. She didn't tell me, darn her. She told me when she was defending, but she didn't tell me the outcome. But her dissertation was on the development of virtue. So I'm excited to see that. She wants to try to think through this philosophically, which I think is a great idea, and combine that with what we know about human development from a psychological point of view, which is quite a bit.
Great. Thank you. Lee?
Was Aristotle clear on good for whom? I assume he meant good for the polis, but is this, make our polis great again? Was it just our polis against the others, or was he able to kind of scale this globally?
That's a good question, because one of the ways that, of course, ancient Greek society is very different from ours is that it was city-states, and that these city-states went to war pretty much every year.
Yeah, not good, right?
Yeah, they fought all the time, and they couldn't get along. And they barely could form an alliance when the Persians brought an enormous army into Greece, and some of them didn't join up, and some of them did, and it was a dicey affair right down to the end. So, and the other thing that I need to own and comment on as well with Aristotle is that he was a creature of his time. Males were citizens, females were not. Slaves were slaves because that was their natural place in the world. We don't believe that for the most part anymore. And I would repudiate that entirely. I think that he was wrong about women. He was wrong about people who had been enslaved. And if you read what he says about it, it's really thin. So he didn't think it was even a question, which is the way that most ancients thought of it. They thought slavery was perfectly natural. And they saw a clear hierarchy between men and women. But in Athens at the time he was there, every male was a citizen. So there was at least as much egalitarianism there as there has been in the US, and sometimes more. And the way they picked their state officers was by lottery. So you'd be just as likely to be the person in charge this year as, Governor Cuomo. So every year they pick somebody to be by lot, and their idea was we don't want anyone to be jury rigging the system so that they can control too much. So the good for whom, I think Aristotle's view was good for human beings, but then he made these distinctions among human beings that we don't make. So I think the translation to us is good for human beings, period, simplicity.
But it seems like it was local to the polis. A key insight I learned from Peter Singer is that there's no moral distinction between someone you know and someone you don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's a very powerful concept. Mm-hmm. And I'm not clear that that's being addressed here.
Right, no, that's a good point, because that society, I guess to take it a little bit further, was very tribal. And that's, now of course, that's a negative prejudice against people in tribes. I don't mean it that way. I just mean that they acted in a way that my people are the important people and other people don't matter. And so the way you became a slave in ancient Greece is if your city got conquered. So that's the extent of that I can make you a slave if I come to your city and conquer it. And it happened all the time. So it wasn't a racially based slavery the way it was in this country. It was a matter of who got conquered and who didn't. And so people in other places didn't enjoy the same rights. There was no such thing as inalienable rights. There was no such thing as universal rights in those days. So that's the way it's different. Now, what I would argue is that we still don't have those things. What we have is a social agreement that we have rights. And as long as we uphold those rights socially, we have them. If we stop, we lose them. It's that simple. So it's not, I don't have any rights inside me, in other words, any more than an ancient Greek had rights inside him. That what we have are these practices.
And we don't even have a social agreement that we have rights, okay?
Not entirely.
Not even close.
And what those rights are, yeah. We fight a lot about that. And that's that thing, is no one has a final word. So I think we're struggling with that more than we have in some ways. In other ways, we're now starting to celebrate the rights of people who have been historically treated as without rights. So I think there's some good shifts and some bad shifts, but we're in the middle of a big fight about this right now. And I have no idea how it's going to turn out. I have an optimistic version and a pessimistic version. There'll probably just some mess in between.
I think Zach and then Waldemar. I saw hands.
So for me, it's fascinating, the idea of attraction and compulsion. Like I'm picturing a red circle and I'm naming it compulsion, and attraction is a green circle.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of those visuals.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like in the compulsion circle, whenever people enter, right, and the compulsion, let's say it's coming from your religion or even your really, really strong belief in empirical science or whatever, like in that circle, when people come and try to do stuff, the conflict arises. There's a potential for more conflict. But if you're in the green circle, let's say, and you're trying to work towards something, the solution, so it seems like because we're interdependent, and so the human potential comes out potentially, and then you're not talking about my tribe versus your tribe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just fascinated that long ago, what was his background that he came up with these really deep insights at such a deep level?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's awesome that someone from 2,300 years ago speaks to us so powerfully still. And Aristotle's been in and out of fashion over that entire time, but he never entirely disappeared. And so now his physics, that's completely outmoded. His idea about biology is not true. We know better now, but his ethics are just as valuable now as they were when he wrote them. Like I said, we amend them because to appropriate them in our time requires that. I can't explain how it is he knew what he knew. I mean, he had Plato and Socrates, after all, who guided him, and they had the pre-Socratics. And so the Greeks had a long tradition of trying to think through things deeply. And so he was standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were. But then, some people say that all of philosophy since then is just commentaries on Plato and Aristotle.
I do think that the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle trio is just arguably just the most remarkable influence, certainly in Western. I mean, that those three individuals had the impact that they did in the way it is. It is I think it's just without parallel in terms of three people that just remarkable.
And Blaine, I just want to comment on your style and how you present it. It's so simple. Like, I mean, even I got it, right? So I'm not that well read. A lot of people here are a lot more well read than me, but it was really well done. It just made practical sense to me. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Zach. That's what I aim at, because I want to make things accessible to people, and not that you need 5 years of study and a lexicon of jargon in order to understand and use. Because I think this is stuff that we can use every day, that can be a part of our lives. The other thing I should say is it's not just that philosophical tradition. Remember, Aristotle lived in the golden age of Athens, when there was a lot of intellectual foment and discussion and interaction. He lived in a democratic society, like I said, a true democracy, not a republic, as we live in. So they voted on everything. The assembly voted on everything. And it's far from perfect, and there were all kinds of problems, but he lived in a remarkable time, and I think that made his remarkableness partly possible. Again, to get back to the sociality element, that we need an environment that allows us to express our best selves.
Waldemar?
Blaine, I enjoyed your presentation very much. It's nice to see you and hear you again. I have actually a question directed about developmental psychology. I'm curious how you view, there's two parts to this question. The first part is, how do you view, what are the innate tendencies of very young children towards ethical behavior before we pollute them? And secondly, further on in our lives, what do you see as the relationship between ethics and resilience.
Okay. First, I have to say your office is exactly as I pictured it. With the wall and the chair and everything. It's great. So maybe I get you pretty well. That's kind of fun. I mean, you do present in a very authentic way, so maybe that's why. So with the developmental psychology, well, yeah, I promised to come back to that point and I didn't. I love developmental psychology because they do some of the most fascinating studies ever. And those people have an unfair advantage because when they present, they show videos of young children. And everyone's like, oh, I can't do that really because what am I going to show? I don't have those kind of videos. So anyway, but one example of this is if you put 7 to 9 month olds in a situation where they're just sitting and observing adults interacting or even puppets interacting, and you have a puppet or a person who treats someone else unfairly, the infant will react to that. They recognize the unfair treatment. They will prefer a fair actor to an unfair actor, always. And they see it, they understand it. Now, remember, 9 month olds can't say a word, usually. Most of them can't say a word. Most of them can't walk yet. They've just learned to sit up and grab things reliably and manipulate things reliably. But they have a basic intuition of justice already. And that just develops over time. And so if you get older kids like 18 months olds, they can do even more. They can rectify the injustice if they have the ability to do that. So for example, if you put two kids in a situation and they're going to do something and they get a reward of cookies, and one of them gets 3 cookies and the other one gets 1 cookie, but they both contributed, the one that gets the 3 cookies will almost always give a cookie to the other kid. So if it's just a windfall, it's a little different. But if there's a sense of having earned it, that they're almost always going to share the wealth. Chimpanzees don't do that. You give one chimpanzee some food, they eat it all. They don't share. Now bonobos share. So that's an interesting interspecies thing. And then people argue about, are we more like bonobos or are we more like chimpanzees? And the answer is yes.
Yes. So it would be reasonable to say that we are born with some sort of ethical impulse.
Mm-hmm. I believe that's true. Yeah.
And that exactly what you said, that it is incumbent upon us and important to develop that impulse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another line of research was done by, what's his name? Oh, shoot, I can't think of it now. He wrote Becoming Human. Oh, Michael Tomasello. And they did helping research, and they found virtually universally 18-month-olds, 16-month-olds will help an adult who indicates that he or she needs help. Now, interestingly, the chimpanzees would do the same thing. Where they found a difference is that humans will persist in trying to get their partner to interact and play together if the partner stops. Chimpanzees won't. So there's that sociality element as well. The mutual play is a big thing. But yeah, there's these inclinations that seem really natural, and they have these funny videos where I love the one where the one kid is going to help and he has to stand up, and it takes like 15 seconds to stand up. So he has to bend over, lift his legs up, and then he's on all fours and he gradually pushes himself up till he can stand up. Then he walks over and helps. So it's kind of effortful. It wasn't just easy to do. So yeah, then we start introducing other kinds of incentives. Human beings do respond to incentives. Thing I love about self-determination theory is their demonstration that if someone does something that they're intrinsically motivated to do, and you start giving them extrinsic rewards, they pretty much slow down or stop doing it for intrinsic reasons. They only do it if they get the rewards. So that's one of the ways we spoil kids, is we reward them for things they want to do by themselves. And another one is we constrain them and put them in boxes and rooms and insist on certain kind of disciplinary practices that aren't really very conducive to being curious and engaged. So there's a lot of things that happen. Then there's stuff kids do to each other. What was the second part of the question? I've forgotten now.
The second part is when we are adults and we have worked on our ethics and tried to develop them, how does having a well-developed ethical construct, if you will, influence the ability to practice resilience?
Oh, resilience, yeah. Well, I think that I think it is the key to resilience, really, because what does it mean to be resilient? It means that if we face obstacles or adversity or something that could kind of snow us under, could overwhelm us, that what is it that keeps us coming back and keeps us making efforts? I think it's this love of the good, that even if I'm facing waves of negativity or waves of adversity, I continue to struggle. And I've become a huge RBG fan, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I always thought well of her, but since she became more frail and more stories started to come out about her, it's like, wow, what a hero. I mean, what a quiet hero, what a beautiful kind of celebrity. And what did she do? Well, when she was in the majority, she wrote majority opinions. And then when she became in the minority, most of the time, she wrote dissents. And what she said is her dissents weren't just disagreements. These were the stepping stones to the future, because future law is built on dissent. And so I have to write this now, and I have to write it in a compelling way so later on people can use it. That's resilience. You're facing the Roberts Court as a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has championed equal rights her entire legal career and made huge strides. And that's starting to get eroded gradually. And other kinds of things like sensible laws and so on about guns or things like that. She writes those dissents to change the world in the future, not now, because she knew she couldn't change it now. That's phenomenally visionary. And it kind of helps me to think about, the work that I do, because I don't think I'm changing the world. And I get to talk to interesting people, and I think sometimes people take what I say and build it into their lives, but that's pretty small potatoes, really. But I can hope I'm laying some seeds. I'm setting up some groundwork. I'm doing what I can as one small person. And so to me, that's what the resilience is that we recognize we can't defeat the waves of adversity, or we can't control the world, but we keep going nonetheless because we think it's right. I think it's a good thing to do.
Would you agree then that the capacity for resilience depends upon, at least in part, the extent to which we develop our ethics?
I think for a lot of people it does. I think some people are resilient though just because they want more money or because they want more power. So they're defeated and they come out of defeat to seek victory in their power realms or in their money making. So I think, again, that's still the love of a good, but it's not maybe the good we'd hope they'd love the most. That's what I'd say about that.
Thank you.
Blaine, how
But I
is
love
politics defined?
Just exactly. I just want to say I love the question because it does get us to this thing about there are people who aren't great people who are still resilient. They still bounce back from defeat. They still overcome obstacles. How is it? Well, I think it's the same thing. They love the good. They've just picked a lesser good to attach to. Anyway, go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how do you define politics from Aristotelian perspective? Like they talk politics and polis, and could you with that?
Yeah, so that's right. Politics is a derivative of the term polis, which is the city. And for Aristotle, all the politics, the important politics was local. We live in a different world. We live in a world of nation states. And so politics is much broader and of nation states that are at least some of the time attempting to live well together and to have a good world. Sometimes we're not doing that, or we have very different visions about what that good world is. And so we'll sometimes fight over that. And sometimes it comes to violence even. So I think the politics for him is how do we work together to make the best world? So it's pretty idealistic. And in our time, it feels wildly idealistic. How do we help our Congress and our president and our legislatures and our governors work toward a better world? And part of the problem is that we're so divided. And we have such different views of that, and we have very little sense of what's common to all of us. And I see that as incredibly tragic, because there's so much that's common to all of us. There's so much we agree about, and then we disagree about some things, and that's almost all we pay attention to, is what we disagree about. And then we have this fluky election where we elect a leader who is by design a divider. And so what he does is he makes divisions more prominent and accentuates them. And so we're even more divided now than we were 4 years ago. And if he succeeds again, we'll be even more divided again. And who knows if we'll ever be able to be united again. So I think that's the big struggle we have. And one of the ToK talk I went to was the one by Michael Mascolo. And that really interesting idea that he and Gregg have about how to recreate the ability to talk to people who see things very differently than ourselves. I think we need that. And I think that's always a human struggle. It's really hard to do. But we need to do it, and we need to have an idea of the common good being so worthwhile that it's worth that struggle. That we can't just, well, Lincoln said, house divided can't stand. It's not going to last forever if we keep doing this. It's going to come to a breaking point of some sort or another. I don't know which one it will be, but I don't think we can go on indefinitely this way. If nothing else, our adversaries in the world will divide us to the point where we split, we come apart, even if we don't do it to ourselves, which I think we could do. There have been some threats. So scary stuff. So yeah, Aristotle had an idealistic politics. He also was a realist. And so one of the things he does in the politics is he talks about all the different constitutions. And he thought democracy was a bad one because it leads to mob rule. So if you could have a democracy where you had the best people holding sway, that would be the best. That's his view. But he didn't call that democracy. I forget what he called it. There's a different term.
Blaine, are you familiar at all with Ken Wilber?
I know the name, but I don't.
Right.
I'm not having.
Anyway, he's an integral theorist, philosopher, and has a broad philosophy, psychological system. But here's one of the things that he said, and I think this will resonate with you. Of all of its flaws, the pre-modern philosophy was relatively well balanced between the good, the true, and the beautiful. Mm-hmm. However, when science comes along, it grabs a hold of the true is and separates the ought, and then we become imbalanced in relationship to giving epistemological authority to science as the statements about what's true, and then that undermines our attention and our shared sense of what is good and beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I would say that the 21st century requires a return to a more holistic view of knowledge that is balanced around our pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it seems to me that this framing and the way I know you appreciate it, the is ought, relation and the sort of intersubjective, objective view of the good, and that can be distilled, seems to me to allow us a lot more common ground around how to cultivate virtue. And so I just wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Oh, you're right. I resonate to it very strongly. I happen to be someone who puts still quite a bit of faith in science, but I don't think we can do social science in the absence of talking about ethics and morality. That I think that they're tied hand in hand. And I think the way I presented Aristotle is I get that from him. Yeah. Is that with the function argument, there's no bright line between what is and what ought to be or what's good. So in the evolution of ethics, that's what I'm talking about, is that the science of evolution leads me to understand humans as ethically minded, inescapably so. We're not going to do it well. We're going to have a lot of arguments about it. There are going to be some fantastic counterexamples. But in general, most people are interested in an ethical world. And they may do it well, they may do it poorly. So I think that when we study as psychologists or sociologists or political theorists or whatever we're doing, we have to understand that not only are the people we're studying pursuing the goods that they think are worthwhile, so are we in our study itself. So we can't keep an arm's length from those things. Science is a human project like all human projects. No different than education is, no different than medicine in that way. We want to do things that are going to benefit the world. I mean, otherwise, why would we do it? I mean, there are a few people who are in it for the fame and the money, but they're usually disappointed. And it doesn't tend to work out very well for them because that's not what the enterprise is about. The enterprise is about generating knowledge. If you're about that, then you can prosper and you can have a really good time doing it.
Correct.
So yeah, I resonate with it a lot. I think the fact value dichotomy is a mistake. I violate it frequently and gleefully.
Great. Any other questions or comments or reflections here? We're at 6:42, so we're already a little over 6:30 time.
Well, I just want to say that I'd like to see more of this. Like, I wish that there was more justice and virtue in the world. And I feel like it's kind of like been educated out of us through modernity. And that very few people even have a comprehension or understanding of it. So I'm just happy to have somebody talk about it. And I want to see an increase of it everywhere. So here's to hoping. So.
Right. Well, I think that's certainly kind of I think you look at it a couple of different ways. I think there's this Steve Pinker view, Enlightenment now. There has been some notions around progress, I think, that we have to embrace in certain regards. And we certainly haven't, I think that we have created societies that are in some ways are increasingly sensitive and rational in some ways. At the same time, I think that for me at least, and this is kind of the point, that I think that we've lost clarity about what we mean by virtue. And I think it's dissipating. And I think the scientism and sort of and when we killed God, to put it in Nietzsche's term, our capacity to feel clear about what we need to approach, what we need to be drawn by, the virtues, and what justifies that, how deeply it justifies it. That to me is my own concern, and I think we need to revisit that in our education and in our society and reawaken it crucially. And that's when we think about the transition from modernity into whatever the digital next world will be, we have to revive that if we're going to be sustainable, I believe.
Yeah, just glance through the comments. So sorry if I laughed a little bit. Some of them were pretty funny. I wasn't laughing at you, Greg. But one of the things that came up in the comments, I just would be one closing remark, is one of the things I didn't talk about today that's really, really important is another thing we evolved to be is to favor us first. So we're very in-group, out-group oriented, and that we can't discount that. That's part of our humanity. So that is one of the things I think we need to overcome, particularly in the modern world, because we can't do without the other. We're tied together too tightly now, and it's too easy to blow each other up or to ruin each other. So I think that's one of those things that we have to do. But if we recognize that that's a built-in thing, then that gives us some ways to think about how to change it and how to set up our lives and our society so that we don't do that. And the us, them could be clans, it could be cities, it could be states, it could be countries, it could be religions. Could be the educated and the uneducated, or more educated and the less educated, I should say. All kinds of things like that. So the wealthy and the poor. So we have to have ways of overcoming that in order to deal with this. That also goes back to the question about the polis and who is we? Sometimes we is just my people, and there's a whole bunch we could say about that, and that's a whole other talk. So I don't want to go into it in any detail, but I want to mention that that's one of the stumbling blocks we have, especially in today's world.
Amen. All right. Well, on that note then, Blaine, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. I think as I as I hope you feel, I'm really passionate about this topic. And I appreciate the shining light that you, give. And it's certainly, speaking for myself, it opened up, the fact value complication and the need to orient towards virtue. You opened that up for me, and I appreciate you sharing that here. So thanks so much, friend.
Well, I want to applaud your interest and attention and engagement. I really appreciate it. It's quite a gift to me. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Blaine. It was nice.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Have a good one. We'll be in touch. Thanks, Blaine.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Take care.